Welcome to the Westminster Tradition podcast, where we unpack lessons for the public service. I'm Alison Lloyd-Wright, Managing Director of the Good Trouble Group and recovering public servant. And joining me today on Tarragal land are fellow recovering public servants Caroline Crozer-Barlow.
Hello, Alison.
And Managing Director of Good Government Advisory, Danielle Elston.
Hello, Alison.
This is a special episode of the Westminster Tradition podcast recorded live at the ANZSOG National Regulators Community of Practice Conference 2025. So the framing for this discussion is from James Shipton and his work, The Regulatory State, Faults, Flaws and False Assumptions. We'll link that in the pod notes, which highlights systemic flaws in how regulators are designed, governed and measured. From day one of the conference, we've heard from powerful frontline stories about preventing harm, innovation under constraint and the cultural side of regulation. We've also heard from the participants at this conference about the live issues you care about: independence, coherence across agencies, culture and resourcing.
Always resourcing.
You know they can turn off our mics. That's another thing we don't normally have, which is we don't have control over whether we can talk over each other. So this could be interesting.
Good point. Back in my box.
So we're going to talk about 5 themes: policy versus regulator responsibility, regulatory coherence, independence versus interference, culture and boldness, and the reality of being asked to do more with less. So let's kick off on policy people versus regulators. And let's start by actually being clear about what we mean there, because I characterised myself earlier in the day as a policy person, and some people online rightly queried the distinction between being a policy person and a regulator. And I think a bit like how you described it yesterday, Danielle, sometimes if you're purely in a regulatory agency, you're doing all of those things.
Yep.
And then sometimes you're a regulatory function in a much bigger picture.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of different things, and there was a lot of talk yesterday, and I'm really keen to reflect some of it, which is we probably have more practitioners here than anything else in regulatory functions, and that tension sometimes between what a policy or the ledge writers or parliamentary council have left you with as a regulatory system that you have no control over, and then that kind of complaints, whether they're public or industry or minister, about why you're doing it not exactly the way everyone thought it would happen. And I had 2 conversations on the walk to dinner last night where people were explaining their ledge to me and the wild misunderstanding that the public has about what they can and can't do. So I would also frame up the policy. I mean, I have been both. Yeah. I've been a regulator with 33 acts committed to my branch for my sins, and also been in that policy teams where you go, right, we want, the minister or the government wants to go in this direction, I will have to fix the licensing part over there. There's a tension between those 2 things, and I'm not sure everyone understands each other's worlds very well, and that's a lot of what yesterday's conversation was. Do the policy people get the practitioners, but also do the practitioners get the policy people?
Yeah, I think it's one of the hardest distinctions to come across, and especially as someone who started life as a policy person and then inherited some regulatory functions and then inherited some functions that were part of quite tightly regulated sectors. Like I used to run family daycare for anyone who's worked in that space. And I think that challenge of kind of how do we speak about what is... There is discretion in regulatory systems, and that is partly a policy choice of how regulators enact things, but also that discretion is so bounded by the system in which people sit. And I think that's where some of these really challenging questions come about.
And so Danielle and I decided we would share a story from... because I've never been a regulator, and in fact I was that pain in the ass who sat at Department of Premier and Cabinet and just went, how hard is it really, guys? Come on. And so the particular incident we're going to talk about is a former South Australian Premier had a noble ambition to ensure that all our legislative and regulatory frameworks embraced the LGBT plus community as much as possible. And what that meant is we needed to make some changes to the births, deaths and marriages system to allow births to be registered as neither male nor female and to allow registration of same-sex relationships. This was before marriage was legal. And so my perspective as the policymaker and enforcer of the Premier's thing was to say, I mean, how hard can it be to change both those things? How hard was it, Danielle?
I'm still not over it. So land records and identity records are, of course, the foundation of civilised democracy. You need to know who owns what land and who everybody is and then count their heads. There's probably slightly more to it for the academics in the room, but that's my gist. And you need to do that post-1960 on a computer. And the one we had a black screen with green writing. And was a legacy system, was completely unsupported. The original, I don't know, tie-dyed person who had built it in the 65 no longer existed. And we could not change any fields. And another jurisdiction had just done the big ICT upgrade at a cost of, I think at the time it was about $100 million. And we were in a world where you couldn't get 30 cents.
It's worth noting that no money was attached to this at all.
Just a bit more, just a bit of reg change with not a single dollar attached to it or a human or anything else. Thanks, DPC. And the challenge was it wasn't an issue of policy intent. It was that we just did not, that ICT system could not change fields. And any attempt to go, we'll just get a 19-year-old in and see if we can do it, risked the foundation identity documents that connected to ASIO, the AFP, immigration, like they are the biggest ones around. And so it became a question of were we being recalcitrant on the policy intent? And I suppose our return argument was, were you being particularly recalcitrant on not understanding anything practical and just waving your hand around asking for things?
Probably, yes, right? And so I do think there's this gap between understanding the kind of lived reality of being a regulator in terms of monitoring compliance and enforcement from some of those, policy white towers in the centre, ivory towers.
I mean, that just while I'm thinking of it, the other one on that one was you were also responsible for international identity documents. So you had to be able to, it's fascinating versus marriages, you had to be able to kind of licence or approve whether a birth certificate from another country was valid. And like there's a whole bunch of things in that space, tiny little area of government usually with very few FTE that is like mind-blowing.
So I guess this leads us then into the next kind of theme, which is why can't we all just get along? Right? Why is it so hard to connect regulatory practice in government? And by that I mean connect regulatory practitioners with other regulatory practitioners, but also with the other mechanisms of government.
Well, I've been having an enormous amount of fun lately in the early childhood education and care sector. And for those of you who aren't aware, there's been, I don't know what rock you've been under, but there's been a really big and significant concern about particular child safety issues occurring in centres. And one of the things that has really struck me through this process is that we started out with a regulatory system, so the states and territories are the regulators, and we even managed to get a national law. I'm like, wow, that's a pretty big deal. And then, so that's kind of been plugging along over here. And then the Commonwealth over here has they went from putting about $8 billion in the system to about 14, it's going to be $15 billion this year into the system over a decade. And not surprisingly, the sector has just ballooned, right? So you've got, on the one hand, these state and territory regulators over here just puttering along. Every year it comes along to another budget bid and they might say to their agencies, oh, look, I think there's a few more services, maybe we need a bit more money. And the state treasuries go, not a chance.
Be more productive.
Exactly. Maybe you could just do a little bit more with less. And the Commonwealth over here is like, well, I'm spending $16 billion on like making childcare cheap through childcare subsidy. you guys need to do the quality bit. And I think that sense of the complete disconnect between a funding policy lever over here, very interested in growing accessibility of early childhood education and care, and a regulatory system over here that is kind of interested in quality, is very interested in compliance, noting those two things are a little bit different because the quality improvement of the regulatory system is a bit different. And it's this exact mismatch. And so what we're living through now is this like really creaking process as the Commonwealth has had to come back to the table and go, oh, hang on a second. Like actually we need to not just put money out, we need to make sure it's being spent in a safe way. And the states are coming to the table and having to say, oh, we can't keep underfunding our regulators in this way. And I've been trying to think about what's the lesson from this, apart from that we just let things get to crisis and then we talk to each other. I'm going to throw to you guys while I think about whether there is a lesson from this. What does that make you guys think?
I think you've nailed the old regulators get money when someone notices it's not being done. And I'm going to steal Tony Lawler's underpants from yesterday.
I mean, that sounds inappropriate. I wasn't here yesterday.
No. And no one else. But so around like the regulator being like underpants, which is you don't really know that it's there unless there's a big accident and they don't do enough to contain it.
Yeah, I think we just want things to be invisibly and magically good.
Yes.
But we don't really know what good means.
Yeah.
And we're not really invested in the systems that make them invisibly and magically good.
But is this also a broken federation bit?
Well, maybe it is. Let's talk about federation in a second. But for me, the first part of this, and I was thinking about this during James's opening remarks as well, I think we can mistakenly think there is an objective good that we could have known in advance if we had sat down and really thought about exactly how much regulation do we want in the system, how exactly do we want to enforce it, what does that look like? I hold much more with the idea that we co-construct as we go along and we work out actually what do we prioritise as a community. And I don't think there was a kind of right-sized starting point here. And in fact, I know that there was a piece of work that's been kicking around in ECEC called the National Regulatory Resource Standard. Someone in this room may have even worked on it. And they said, what would it cost to get every regulator? Yeah, like hard yards, right? And it was what would it cost to kind of assess and rate every service in a certain amount of time and do all the kind of things. And that work went nowhere, partly because the Commonwealth government defunded the national partnership. Thanks a lot, Burmo. But partly also because I think people looked at the number and they weren't quite sure that was what they were willing to pay.
And so here I've got a question from the audience which kind of draws out some of these things. Policy development needs to include implementation planning. When it doesn't, the operational arms of regulators are left looking like blockers when they say, no, we can't do that. Does policy training include this basic principle?
Increasingly, I think it does. And so increasingly, I think, like I've seen a number of kind of policy-making toolkits. ANZSOG has a great one that, and we certainly adapted it in the Department for Education in South Australia. And they do now increasingly recognise this question of you actually have to think about how you're going to do your bright idea. To the question of blockers, one thing I would say, and here's like some gratuitous advice to regulators and to my friend Danielle,
ask for it.
I know, but you're going to get it anyway, love. Because the thing you said before, right, about, if we mess up births, deaths and marriages records, we undermine civilisation. That is such a classic overreaching statement from a regulator. And my inside policy voice was like, oh, yeah, okay, let's see what happens now, right? And so I think...
You're accusing me of hyperbole in the mic.
In public.
In public, yes, sorry. But I do think there's something about both sides of the conversation need to come together. So policymakers need to be much less la-di-da, here's my blank piece of paper on which I'm going to write the world.
Here's my blue sky vision.
Oh, I have so many blue sky visions. And similarly, regulators need to be really taking people on the journey, because sometimes what you hear as an impenetrable block isn't an impenetrable block. Sometimes those things are actually soluble. So I think it's like there's a way of raising questions and a way of approaching problems that works better with your central agency fairy.
And so we had a conversation earlier with a regulator in this room who was describing the unique position of being a regulator insofar as you're ignored. I was saying that one of the joys of life after the public sector is that no one rings me at 6 a.m. And he said that one of the great joys of being a regulator is mostly no one rings you at 6 a.m. until there's a crisis. So, left to manage your own world until something explodes in a big and messy way. Yeah. But part of being left to manage your own world is forgotten about. And he was describing, key information that really should have been shared that wasn't. And his advice was, as a regulator, you've got to go to them, right? You have got to be actively engaging with the policymakers and politicians even regularly to tell them what you're doing. So I think that's a good segue into...
Hang on. I just want to go back for a sec. No, I'm not going to defend myself. It's fine. But just the across-government piece and just how the punters, whether they're small business or individuals, how they experience us as government, and how we were talking more about levels of regulatory, but even inside a jurisdiction, how much easier they find it if we do work together. And we did quite a bit of that at CBS. But it was really driven by the fact that we had no money. And the ATO did. And SAPOL did. And so...
SAPOL is police force.
Did. And so, you did liquor licensing, you'd have a branch of SAPOL and we would map it all out together. And it was driven by two things, I think. One is that we were really resource poor, so that we were able to look at other parts of the regulatory system and go, well, we'll marry up with these guys and it will help getting some stuff done that we don't have resources for. Yeah. And a small jurisdiction, it was about relationships. It was about relationships between 4 or 5 commissioners who were like, oh, have we all gone down Jetty Road, Glenelg and knocked on their doors for different things in the last week? That's not excellent government engagement with business. Let's go together and once so that we don't have your industrial stuff as separate to your food safety and whatever else. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for regulators to work together and make it a bit less confusing, because as I often say to people, they just see government. They don't see separate bits. They just see a bit of government that's asking them to fill out something or do something. And if we can do it together, it's a lot better.
So I want us to talk now, with the freedom of being recovering public servants, about the interplay between regulation and politics, independence and interference. The participants at this conference last night heard from the New Zealand Deputy Prime Minister, and we'll try and share some of his views linked to them somehow in the pod notes. But he is on a very strong dereg agenda.
Yeah, until something bad happens.
Right. And so Danielle and I had the pleasure of being seated with some of his staff, and we sort of took them up on that point. It's all very well to be the dereg guy, so long as you're prepared to be the guy that is also facing the music when the child dies.
Yeah.
Or
the house falls down, or the car runs off the road, or whatever.
Yeah.
And it invited a conversation about, how should regulatory practitioners manage that interface between a minister who something has gone wrong, we have had an explosion in her underpants, and and the kind of instinctive political response is to go, obviously, I will fix that. And I will fix that by regulating in such a way to make sure that that never happens again.
Yeah.
And how much of what the Deputy Prime Minister characterised as regulatory overreach actually has its origin in ministerial directions, not regulatory practitioners putting forward a suggestion.
Absolutely. I mean, I think Danielle Wood referred to them as regulatory hairballs in the speech before the productivity
Which is a
roundtable.
visceral description I do not enjoy.
Oh, I know, but like it's great because it does make you think, it makes you pause on the idea, right? And I think what she was calling out is exactly this tendency to, instead of take a big step back and look at the whole system and understand the ways in which we're accreting risk in various areas, it's like, oh, well, we definitely know it's the ones with blue doors that are the problem, so we are going to regulate against blue doors. That is the ministerial answer, right? And so in ECEC at the moment, one of the big pushes is around putting CCTV into childcare centres. And everyone I know who works in ECEC would say that there are some really significant challenges with doing that. There are challenges associated with the safety of the data, of actually what's being recorded. There are challenges associated with the rights of children. There are challenges associated with your workforce and whether you're going to be able to retain and keep a workforce that's being monitored in that way. There are lots of challenges, right? And I have been actually quite impressed at the period, like in the kind of month or so that this has been going, is we went from a New South Wales minister who was very much like, yep, this is definitely where we go, we're definitely doing CCTV, to now they're doing a trial, right? That's good. Like, I'm all about evidence-based, let's actually see if things work. But the space for that conversation was only made because every party and every jurisdiction owned a bit of the problem. What's been happening in ECEC is a 10-year problem. They've all tagged in it in some particular way. You've heard Coalition Shadow Minister come out and say, we're part of this. You've heard the current Minister say, we were part of it. So that political space was what was required to get them to a place where they didn't just create another regulatory hairball. I don't know how we help them get that political space. That's the...
Well, and often, not always, but the minister you have who has the responsibility for the regulatory function, thinking here particularly about like consumer protections, is usually around the cabinet table, one of the more junior ministers.
If they're around the cabinet table, like often in kind of...
Indeed. And so when something goes wrong, not only are they getting beat up in the press, they're getting beat up usually by their first minister to say, solve this. I think you might have some examples from your time in consumer and business services there, Danielle.
Oh, a few. Gee, the live thing really puts you on the spot when you know you can't edit, doesn't it? I will speak generally. What I would say is that this issue of ministerial, so it's like what the role of government is, less even so the role of a regulator. So very few ministers are prepared to say, look, if you buy a car and they've rolled back the odometer and it doesn't have wheels on it, it's buyer beware, bad luck, there's no consumer protection for that. Very few, there's an expectation that government stops shonkiness and that you can't go into Kmart and buy a toy or go to the Easter show or the Royal Adelaide show, get a bag of small crappy bits of plastic for $195 to give to your 4-year-old. There's an expectation that having gone through that process, that it's, your kid's not going to choke on it on the train going home, and that it's not full of lead. And so, but the challenge, as you all know, is you are not walking behind every Facebook marketplace seller who's selling Nana's Corolla, and there are 295 bazillion bits of crappy plastic in the show bags. And so all of the expectations of the community and the minister sit on your shoulders when it is not possible to check every toy. And
yet I think there's this kind of public expectation that regulators should be catching every shonk.
Well, I don't even think they think of it as regulators. It's that the government wouldn't allow this thing to be sold if it wasn't safe. And here we get to trust in government, right, which is we can have as many arguments that I agree with and believe with around proportionate risk and regulatory models, but we'd really have to bring the public with us, because if they don't think we're keeping them safe...
Yeah.
Then we, like, if more so in your medicines and a few other places, then we really start to run a big risk of that disconnection with trust in government.
Yeah. Did you want to talk about kind of from that regulator's mindset, what is and isn't independent, and how do you straddle that need to be responsive but also a statutory officer with your own legislation that sets out specifically what you can and cannot do?
Yeah. I would say that we lean towards the independence part. I know that there's a feeling sometimes amongst regulators, and we have had so much fun in the last 24 hours talking with you all, but about that kind of we have pressure to head in this direction or that direction from a political perspective. I would say I think that there's a few things. You're not usually independent. Your staff are usually either public sector or public servants, so they're covered by codes. Your budget's allocated by government. Your computers are usually chosen. So it's not the degree of independence. We're not running a corner store or a franchise of Athlete's Foot here. We are a part of government as a regulator. One of the massive challenges is they're often tiny and bolted onto the side of some agency, bigger agency for its corporate services, and then is mogged from here to kingdom come because you don't really fit anywhere. So that's not independent. When you can be mogged, when you can't choose your computer, there is a massive difference between the commissioner, the boss, and whatever the legislation endows on them as powers that they then may delegate to the inspector or the licensing officer. That decision-making is independent, but it's also not devoid and independent from life and reality and the world. It's not a inner basement activity.
And nor would it be appropriate to be, right? I think, we elect governments make choices about what resources they allocate, about what they set in terms of their regulatory statements of expectations, in terms of direction and focus. We want you to partner more, do less compliance. We want you to do more compliance, less partnering. That to me, and it's always a roundabout and a swing. And I return to my earlier comment that I don't think there's a single right answer. And part of what is happening is that we are creating as we go what the right answer is for now. But that for me feels perfectly appropriate. And in some ways, just an extension of the conversation we often have about frank and fearless.
Yeah.
Right? You are frank and fearless and you say, well, if we do this, this are the risks and I'm happy to write this down. You can't direct my decision in an individual thing. I'm going to make a decision to cut off funding for this dodgy provider because I think that, it's too much. That feels to me like independent is the right...
But people don't love living in lack of clarity a lot of the time. And so which bit's independent and which bit's not, it can feel uncomfortable, I think. And... you need guidance on your decision making. One of the challenges is regulators aren't usually making decisions in their own name. It is usually like a licensing manager or a compliance person. Yeah. And you are making it in the name of
the secretary
or the statutory power, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And so you need a degree of
I know you just spotted the question. I was waiting. There's a cage fight question on the Slido, and I've been waiting.
Where I'm I want to move you guys on because there are some absolute killer questions coming through.
No. I just think that it's. You're independent when the government doesn't, when they want you to be out there floating on your own. As I don't know how we employed that person who made that decision. That's all a bit of a shock to me.
Arm's length from politics.
You're very close and cuddly with them at the time that government will say, we're doing compliance now or whatever else. So it's a degree of agility and adaptability that I would say is tricky for regulators who are usually very structured in their thinking, thank goodness. And this is the bit that is blurrier. And yes, I'll be quiet now.
All right, I want to do one more bit about regulatory failures, which is the kind of the culture of timidity versus boldness. What drives regulator behaviour, and how do you manage the tension of either being too timid and afraid of upsetting or upsetting industry, escalating, or overconfident, like we are the law?
Well, you certainly learn that you might have been overconfident if you accidentally serve subpoenas in a native veg clearing case on Christmas Eve and you end up on the front page of the local paper in response to it. So I feel like I've lived some of
Merry Christmas.
So I think some of the questions around timidity and boldness aren't even necessarily about your action. They're about the presentation of your action and kind of when and how those things come out. Again, I'm really on this theme. I really feel like we shouldn't pretend there's a single right answer. And I know that's a very uncomfortable place, but I think, one of the things I've observed is that really good regulators have leaders who are able to hold that ambiguity in themselves while providing the confidence and clarity downwards. So I think that's really the leadership challenge, right? Is how do you be the one who's like, well, I know this mightn't be the exact right answer forever, but this is what I'm telling the team to do now, and this is how we're approaching it now. And then if we have to move on to a different approach, I see one of our questions here is about how do you recalibrate a regulatory agency that has shifted from focusing on harm minimisation and public safety to one that's doing service delivery. I'm trying to understand what that would be. But, then you have a very big change challenge, right? And then you just need to acknowledge that. All right, yep, we're on the change journey. Now we're going to do this differently. And it doesn't mean you've failed. It means that the world has shifted and that you are shifting with it.
You're talking about leaders. I mean, it really is a leadership challenge, that tight and loose thing around what are we hanging on to, because we still need to hang on to things like, not that I'm going to have a hyperbole crack back at you. However,
definitely should.
What I would say is that all sounds very lovely unless you've got a big organisation and people need clear guidance. They are making decisions that impact individuals, business, whatever else, and they do need more clarity than this kind of like everybody use their best judgment and risk framework, like the kind of big idea stuff. Like at the end of the day, most of it is there are forms, there are checkboxes. What's on them and what's off those checkboxes are still decisions to be made. Yeah. And yeah.
Because then that's the answer, isn't it? It's like you do what you do in the best practice way that you're doing it at the moment. And if you are going to do one of these big swings, then you don't pretend that's what you were always doing. That's a classic. You often hear people say, we partner with industry, and industry, like, I've literally never met that guy before.
Or I do some work with a particular industry who are basically convinced that the regulators are designed to make their industry financially unviable.
Yeah,
and are operating a conspiracy against them.
Yeah. So in that case, I feel like probably you shouldn't come out and say, yeah, we partner. Like it would be like, no, we need to reset our relationship with the industry. This is the moment when we reset it. This is how we're going to reset it. But at the moment, you keep doing the job that we have described and how we described and using the checkboxes that we've described. Yeah. And so I think I'm just stuffing all the uncertainty into the leader, I think.
You are.
Yeah. You're very full little sausages.
Because also the punters don't want the uncertainty. Like they have a wild lack of interest in not just knowing that if they hit that nail on that head, they'll never hear from you again. They're not huge fans of interacting. They're not looking necessarily to partner a lot of the time. What they want to know is how much lead, terrible example, everybody, can I have in that? How much money can I move from here to there? Like, what's the rule? Yeah. And then stay out of my life, please. Yeah. And so you're shoving all the uncertainty in the leader, but there are the outside world and the team who do need certainty.
Yeah.
All right, I can ignore these fabulous questions no longer, and I'm going to start with our top question this morning. In a cage fight, who would win, regulators or policymakers?
I'd take you two. I'd have a go.
I went straight there.
Who's more likely to break the rules is my question.
That's true. That is so true. We'll bite. Right.
but the more serious version of that question is, how do you prevent policy areas overreaching and looking to dictate how you regulate?
Yeah. I mean, that is the real question, isn't it?
I mean, this is the spot for partnership as far as I'm concerned. I think we have faux industry partnerships sometimes. I think the partners we need are still inside government, and they need to be the policymakers and take them out. Take them out on an inspection. Go and find your policy person and get them out of the office or the house. Take them somewhere where they can stay in their tracksuit. Like, let's not be mean. And show them what it is. Show them what it is that you do.
Yeah, get them out of the ivory tower would be my advice as well.
100%.
Let them understand the practical reality of compliance, monitoring, enforcement.
I've got another classic one. Playgrounds.
Oh.
I know I've been on about this for a long time, sorry. Playgrounds are some of the most heavily regulated things I've ever come across.
Along with our hairdressers, of course.
And
we'll tell that story in a second.
Schools we'll often have 4 branches of government come out once a year to inspect the playground. The principal will have to come offline to take them on the tour. They will all have a separate checklist and it will be different across whatevers. I have also worked with NGOs who have been given quite fancy playgrounds that local councils have had to move or whatever, and they've put them in, say, a DFSV shelter so that the kids have something to do while things are sorted out. They've taken them out because they can't figure out how to get them inspected often enough. And that's another one where the old working together would be much better. Like, we definitely don't want the bum burns of the early 80s, but like...
Yeah, okay.
But I think
please don't boomer it by saying, we survived our bum burn, we're fine.
Yeah, there's been way too much bum undercurrents. Anyway, I do think there's something as well in the... So sometimes, and especially in resource-scarce operations, but also I think in spaces where we talk more about partnering, we try and whack compliance functions in with quality improvement functions, and we pretend that there's no contradiction in that.
Yeah, we pretend they're the same thing. They're not.
We pretend they're the same thing. And I like, whatever about you operate in the situation that you're structured in, and there are some things you can't change. I'm a big believer in just saying out loud, this is a tension that we need to manage. How are we managing that we are both responsible for a quality improvement program over here and responsible for whacking you on compliance over here? What's that going to mean when we come to do the quality improvement program? Well, how do we talk to people that we're partnering with about what we see when we're in our quality improvement program place?
When the people you're partnering with are also people you might need to prosecute,
Exactly.
right? So there's a question here, how do you maintain trust and collaboration when you have to prosecute a business due to causing significant harm but want data and information sharing in the future?
Yeah, so like a couple of tactical questions that I've observed in the ECEC space, and there are sort of structural questions where people are doing this at the moment, where they're separating out their regulators and, pulling them out from those other functions. One thing is having a good line into all the different parts of the sector. So you'll hear a lot at the moment about for-profits, not-for-profits, blah, blah, blah. But if you have a good line in with the high quality part of the for-profit sector, for example, that will help you when you are trying to maintain trust and understand the challenges of that part of the sector and then going after the really bad ones, right? And so there's something about having your allies and having the people that you have relationships with overall. Yes.
Another excellent question here. Sorry, did you have something?
No, I'm combusting at the question.
Excellent.
Let me at it.
How does Australian culture influence trust in regulators? We seem to be a culture that hates regulations that restrict our freedom, but love ones that target bogans and tall poppies.
Bring it, Dee.
Was it Kate yesterday talking about the data in, I'm not sure if you're still here, but the data in on domestic violence and the over-policing of low SES areas, because high SE areas don't particularly love police kind of crawling around them, monitoring them, and it completely changes the data input, which then changes the compliance or the criminal strategy. Yes, culture plays a huge influence as to who we go after and why. I'm not sure it's just bogans and tall poppies. I've got a longer list of people, I think, who get the raw end of regulatory compliance versus people who probably just scooch on by pretty easily. It is, I think, a bit class orientated. And I think some of it, we talked a lot yesterday about how a lot of it is based in the Victorian era. And I think when you go to things like the housing crisis, our building, like we first regulated buildings when they started, and we saw all that with the earthquakes, but when they started falling down in various things, and some of them, that was the London fire a couple of 100 years ago, we built those regulatory systems around class. So we didn't say, oh, there's a problem with the rich people who built the building that burnt down in the London fire because they made it out of matchsticks, which we didn't think would catch fire. We went, hey, who was the dude who put the wall up? It's got to be his fault. And so, yes, there is, I think, huge cultural and class elements as to how and where and when we regulate, and that some of our lowest paid jobs, and I think this is particularly, and you might want to kick in here, CCB, which is, we are, and I'm not having a go at it, but there's no doubt that if you are a childcare worker, an aged care worker, a disability worker, we are providing increasing regulatory compliance on you. Absolutely. For the safety of vulnerable people. And, I'm not sure that the top end of town is getting whacked with the same amount of paperwork.
Definitely not whacked with the same amount of paperwork. I do think there was a great line used, in fact, at the Education Minister's press conference on Friday, which said that predators seek out vulnerable children, but more they seek out vulnerable systems. And I've been thinking about that a lot. So, yes, educators are going to be more highly policed, more highly watched. One of the things I talk about is, a lot of the child safety issues in ECEC are what we call rough handling, which is like a terrible name for when an educator is rough with a kid, right? Like they pick them up by the arm, they dump them on the floor heavily. That is both a function of an educator doing the wrong thing, but usually also a function of understaffed services, a function of poor leadership that doesn't recognise and catch that person who is becoming more and more dysregulated as an adult and giving them the intervention that needs to happen at that moment to stop that from happening. What I have been really pleased at, I've got to say, in this early childhood space is that there has been a bit more of a recognition of, actually, to your point, it's not just about the builder putting up the wall. We need to make sure that we're investing in high quality foundations. We need to think about how do you set a workforce up for success, and you don't set up a workforce for success by paying them almost nothing and operating them on the tiniest of skinny ratios.
And so I guess I'm going to not necessarily agree with the premise of the question, because the closest I've ever got to regulation was COVID directions.
That's pretty close. That was pretty
I'm going to say, you regulated us all.
She's a regulator.
Australians love a rule. We like following rules for the most part. Because we think rules are about fairness and equity. Yeah. And so long as we can see the through line between the rule and the outcome, pretty happy to follow one. And going back to the conversation yesterday about the importance of telling the stories of regulatory success, I think part of what's missing sometimes is being able to see that through line, which people would see really obviously in COVID because they were getting the numbers reported every day and they could see that compliance with the direction made the number go down. Yeah. And so how do regulators get that kind of those positive stories out in the world more? Betterer.
It's hard without sounding very so it's hard to go, here's what I prevented. I was giving something in a completely different context the other week, and I'm the hardest thing is to be able to say out loud this awful thing. I stopped a minister from doing something really stupid. That's not on your CV. It's not on your LinkedIn, right? It should be. Talk about a skill. They started off with a really bad idea, and through evidence and arguing, I managed to stop.
Evidence, data and sheer persistence.
I got it away from
shiny things over here, right?
Yeah, right. So criminal intelligence is another one, which is, we only ever find out that it didn't work when something horrible goes wrong. For the vast majority of the time, that intelligence is providing our law enforcement with information that stops bad things from happening. So in order to do what you just said, which is how do we do it, it's very hard to say we found out that so-and-so was about to X and we stopped it. So I don't know the answer because it's talking about risk and it's pretty scary for people to find out. I mean, if they'd all notice if you weren't around. So for all the whining that goes on, they'd notice pretty quickly if all of you stopped working tomorrow.
Yeah.
Probably our final question. We'll see if we get time after this, and because it clearly comes from an existing pod listener, thank you. And the reason I can tell that it comes from an existing pod listener is that it uses the terminology junior burger, which we have debated at length on the podcast. So question from a self-identified junior burger: what key lessons from regulatory failures or failures in general have helped you build your leadership capacity?
I think the lesson I've taken, and I've been involved in more failures than I care to think about, is the knowledge that there's always another day and and in fact, although there was an earlier question that we didn't get to, which was to resign or not to resign, if you have a big regulatory failure, and I would controversially say probably you should resign, because actually faith in the system, even if it wasn't explicitly your fault, and I've seen some very good people fall on their swords for that.
I agree, actually.
I agree.
Yeah, and I think, and I've seen the good people who've fallen on their swords go on to be well respected and have different lives after that as well. So anyway, put that to one side. But mostly when there are failures, you get up the next day and you go out and you talk to the people who maybe you weren't talking to properly before, and you have an opportunity to rebuild trust. And because of the kind of enforced vulnerability of having failed, then you are in you end up with much better relationships if you're willing to do that. And that is, it's hard work, but it's actually also the most meaningful work that you can do. So I kind of think the key lesson for me is that nothing is forever.
This too shall pass.
Yeah.
2, because you snuck a second question in and don't think I didn't notice. The 2 lessons from looking at failures and working on Royal Commissions is, for me, is stop and step back. And I mean for an hour, a whiteboard, a thing. What's the system I'm running? What's the thing I do? What are the basics of it? And step it out from there. I regret the number of times I didn't do that. And I think my work was fine when I didn't, but I think that was the gap, was me not stopping and going, hold up, who am I here to serve? What does the government want? What's my authorising environment? And kind of mapping it all out. And that can really, if you can do that more often, it stops failures. The second one is culture. I don't know if I stole yours, because I have a feeling that might be yours.
No, go for it.
But the second one is, we can make all the rules in the world. We can build ICT systems. We can get new regulatory postures and lovely slides, and they're all important. And I do it for a living, so it's not a problem. And the culture of the place comes from the top, and you can have all of those things and the whole place can still be falling down around your ears, as demonstrated by some of our biggest failures, if you don't have good culture and good leadership.
What does good culture look like to you, Dee? What would you say the kind of 3-5 words?
Just checking I'm allowed to. I think it's the capacity to say, I don't know, the capacity to say, I think I disagree, but I'm not sure. Can I talk through what I think is completely bonkers about this? And an openness to being turned around in both directions. Not obsessed with where people are, what they're doing, no micromanagement, no kind of obsessive processing. That is what, I think obsessive processing kind of can kill culture, and it's about control, and we all know that autonomy leads to those better results.
And my lesson for the junior burgers is to be self-aware and self-reflective. One of the speakers spoke earlier, we were talking about regulatory capture, industry capture, and he said avoid self-capture. That was a great one. But also, my answer is up here on the stage with me, which is to say, find your people. Find people with whom you can have a relationship of trust that's not a competitive relationship where you're worried they're going to dob you to your boss or, tell some networks that you don't know what you're doing, so that you can have those conversations out loud where you say, I've got this issue and I'm a bit in two minds about it. I can see that there's multiple choices and I don't know which is the right one. Can I talk about it out loud with you and have you help me understand what my options are? And so take the most advantage of that here in the room, if you can, to find people in your realm and remit who can do what you two lovely ladies have always done for me.
Okay, yeah.
Aww.
So a huge thank you to the National Regulators Community of Practice Conference 2025 for having us. Till next time.
Just some appropriately bureaucratic disclaimers. While we've tried to be as thorough in our research as busy full-time jobs and lives allow, we definitely don't guarantee that we've got all the details right. Please feel free to email us corrections, episode suggestions or anything else at thewestminstertraditionpod@gmail.com. Thanks to Pampot Audio for our intro and outro music. Till next time.